The champagne bubbles tickled my nose as Karina thrust the second glass into my hand, her perfectly manicured fingers refusing to accept my protests. The bass from the club's sound system vibrated through the VIP booth's leather seats, making the liquid shimmer under the rotating colored lights that swept across our corner of the balcony overlooking the main dance floor. 42 is not dead, Camille, Kelly shouted over the music, her sequined top catching the strobe lights like a disco ball. 42 is freedom. You signed those divorce papers 3 weeks ago. Tonight we celebrate. I took a reluctant sip, the expensive Dom Perignon sliding down my throat with an ease that belied its price tag. My friends had chosen Vertigo, one of São Paulo's most exclusive nightclubs, the kind of place I hadn't set foot in since my early 20s. Back then, I'd been young and fearless, dancing until dawn in clubs far less glamorous than this temple of chrome and glass that catered to the city's elite. 18 years of marriage to Eduardo had smoothed away those rough edges, replaced spontaneity with routine, adventure with predictability. Our divorce had been civil, almost disappointingly so. No drama, no fighting over assets, just two people who'd realized somewhere along the way that they'd become strangers sharing a bed and a mortgage. "The DJ is incredible tonight," Karina said, swaying to the remix of some American pop song I vaguely recognized from the radio. She'd been my closest friend since our daughters attended the same primary school 15 years ago. Where my life had contracted into the narrow confines of suburban respectability, hers had expanded. She ran a successful event planning company, traveled internationally, and seemed to know every doorman and maitre d' in the city. The booth we occupied cost more than my monthly rent on the modest apartment I'd moved into after the separation. I'd protested when Karina announced she'd reserved it, but she'd waved away my concerns with characteristic generosity. "Birthday girls don't pay," she'd declared, and that had been the end of the discussion. Through the glass barrier that separated our elevated perch from the masses below, I watched bodies move in synchronized chaos. The crowd was younger than me, mostly late 20s and early 30s, dressed in clothes that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Before the divorce, I might have felt superior to this display of wealth and beauty. Now, I just felt tired and slightly out of place in the simple black dress Karina had insisted was perfect, but which I knew was at least 5 years out of style. "Oh my God, look at that section over there." Kelly pointed with her champagne flute toward the opposite side of the balcony, where another VIP booth glowed with even more opulent lighting. Unlike our space, which was cordoned off with velvet ropes, that area featured an actual door and tinted glass panels that obscured whoever occupied it from casual view. "That's the owner's private area," Karina said with the authority of someone who made it her business to know such things. "They only open it for very special clients. I heard a Saudi prince was here last month." The champagne was making my head feel pleasantly light, the music's rhythm seeping into my bones despite my determination to remain the responsible adult in our trio. Karina had already finished her second glass and was pouring a third, while Kelly had abandoned her drink entirely in favor of dancing in place, her hips moving with an ease I envied. "Come on, Camille." Kelly grabbed my free hand, pulling me to my feet. "At least stand up. You've been sitting like you're at a funeral since we got here." I rose, unsteady on the heels Karina had lent me because those flats are absolutely not happening tonight. The view from standing was dizzying, both from the height and the alcohol. Below us, the dance floor writhed with energy, a sea of raised hands and swaying bodies bathed in pink and blue light. "I'm too old for this," I said. But even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. The music was infectious. The champagne had relaxed the knots of tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders for months. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, Kelly was right. 42 wasn't dead. 42 was just beginning. "You know what you need?" Karina said, her eyes bright with mischief and alcohol. "You need to get up on that platform and dance. Really dance. like you used to before Eduardo turned you into a soccer mom." She gestured toward a small raised platform at the edge of our VIP section, barely 2 feet off the ground, designed for exactly the kind of exhibitionist behavior she was suggesting. The thought made my stomach flip with anxiety, and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to excitement. "Absolutely not," I said. But Karina was already refilling my glass, pressing it into my hand, with the insistence of someone who would not be denied. "One dance," she said. "That's all. One dance for your 42nd birthday, for the Camille you used to be before you forgot how to have fun." The words stung because they were true. When had I become this cautious person, afraid of drawing attention, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of living? Eduardo had liked me quiet, demure, the perfect wife who hosted dinner parties and volunteered at school fundraisers. The divorce had set me free from his preferences, but I'd discovered I'd forgotten who I was without them. The champagne made the decision easier. I drained the glass, feeling the bubbles explode in my chest like tiny fireworks of courage. "Fine," I said. "One dance. But if I fall and break my neck, you're paying my medical bills." Karina and Kelly erupted in cheers that would have mortified me an hour ago, but now just made me laugh. They helped me onto the platform, steadying me as my borrowed heels found purchase on the small stage. From this height, I could see the entire club, the private booth across from us now at eye level, though its tinted windows still concealed whoever lurked behind them. The DJ transitioned into a new song, something with a driving beat and a bass line that vibrated through the soles of my feet. I closed my eyes, letting the music move through me, remembering what it felt like to dance without caring who watched or what they thought. My hips began to sway, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory from my younger years kicked in. Below me, Karina and Kelly were dancing too, encouraging me with whoops and hollers that barely registered over the music. I spun slowly, my arms raised above my head, feeling the dress swirl around my thighs. The champagne had loosened something inside me, some tightly wound spring that had been coiled for 18 years. I moved backward across the small platform, still swaying, eyes still closed, lost in the sensation of movement and freedom. My back hit something solid, warm, distinctly human. My eyes flew open as I stumbled slightly, strong hands catching my hips to steady me. I'd somehow danced off our platform and directly into someone standing at the entrance to the mysterious private booth. The glass door stood open, and I'd backed right into one of its occupants. Mortification flooded through me, burning away the champagne's pleasant haze. I tried to step forward, to apologize, to escape back to the safety of my friends. The hands on my hips tightened, not painfully but firmly, holding me in place. A voice, low and amused, spoke directly into my ear, the words somehow audible despite the pounding music. "Don't stop." I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs for entirely new reasons. The hands belonged to a man. That much was obvious from their size and strength. I could feel the heat of his body against my back, smell the subtle scent of expensive cologne, mixed with whiskey, and something darker, earthier. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I started to say, but the hands guided me gently back into motion, encouraging the sway of my hips I'd abandoned in my embarrassment. "I was enjoying the show," the voice continued, rich with an accent that suggested education abroad, but roots firmly planted in São Paulo. "Don't let me interrupt." Every instinct I'd cultivated as a respectable suburban housewife screamed at me to pull away, to apologize profusely, to scurry back to the safety of my booth and my friends. But the champagne, the music, and something reckless that had awakened in me tonight made a different choice. I resumed dancing, hyper-aware now of the audience of one behind me. The hands on my hips didn't wander, didn't grab or grope, but they stayed there, a warm pressure that somehow made every movement feel more deliberate, more charged with meaning. The song seemed to last forever, and end too soon simultaneously. When it finally faded into the next track, I found the courage to turn around, to see who had witnessed and encouraged my temporary insanity. He was older than the club's typical clientele, probably late 40s, with dark hair shot through with distinguished silver at the temples. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. But it was his eyes that caught me, dark and assessing, with a hint of amusement that suggested he found the entire situation as unexpected as I did. "Renato Figueiredo," he said, extending a hand as if we'd just been introduced at a business function, rather than after I'd essentially given him a lap dance in a nightclub. "Camille Montero," I replied, shaking his hand and trying to ignore how small mine felt in his grasp. "I really am sorry. My friends convinced me to dance and I had too much champagne and I didn't realize I was backing up into your area." "No apology necessary," Renato said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's my birthday." "You made it memorable." "Your birthday," I repeated, surprised. "It's my birthday too. 42nd. 48th, he replied. The coincidence is noteworthy. Behind me, I could feel Karina and Kelly watching with barely concealed interest. Behind Renato, the private booth revealed itself as I looked past him. Several men in suits sat around a table loaded with bottles that made our Dom Perignon look pedestrian. They were trying and failing to appear disinterested in our conversation. "Would you like to join me for a drink?" Renato asked, gesturing toward his booth. "Unless you prefer to return to your friends. I understand if randomly dancing into strangers isn't typically your preferred way of spending an evening." I should have said no. Should have thanked him politely, returned to Karina and Kelly, finished the night with dignity and tact. But something about his direct gaze, the way he seemed genuinely interested in my answer, rather than presuming it, made me pause. "One drink," I heard myself say, "since it's both our birthdays." Renato's smile widened, and he stepped aside, gesturing for me to precede him into the private booth. As I passed Karina and Kelly, Karina mouthed, "Oh my God," while Kelly gave me an enthusiastic thumbs up. I rolled my eyes at both of them, but couldn't suppress the small smile that tugged at my lips. The interior of the private booth was another world entirely. While our VIP section had been nice, this was luxury bordering on excess. The leather seats were butter soft, the table genuine marble, the bottles arranged on it brands I recognized from magazine advertisements for lives I'd never lived. Renato's associates stood as we entered, a gesture of respect that felt oddly formal given the setting. Renato introduced them briefly. Walter, his attorney. Zeffirino, a business partner in imports. Two other men whose names I immediately forgot, but whose watchful eyes I did not. "We were just leaving," Walter said smoothly, and within moments the booth had emptied except for Renato and myself, the door clicking shut behind the departing men, with a finality that should have alarmed me but somehow didn't. Renato poured 2 glasses of something amber and aromatic, handing me one before settling into the seat across from me. "To unexpected encounters," he said, raising his glass. "To 42nd birthdays," I replied, clinking my glass against his. The liquid burned pleasantly, warming me from the inside in a way the champagne hadn't. "Tell me, Camille Montero," Renato said, settling back in his seat with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to commanding spaces and conversations. "What brings a woman who clearly doesn't make a habit of dancing in nightclubs to vertigo on a Thursday night?" The perceptiveness of the observation caught me off guard. "That obvious?" "You dance like someone who used to know how but forgot for a while," he said. "And when you opened your eyes and realized you'd backed into me, you looked like you wanted the floor to swallow you whole, not the reaction of someone comfortable in this environment." I took another sip of the whiskey, using the moment to decide how much truth to offer this stranger. "Divorce," I finally said. Finalized 3 weeks ago. My friends decided I needed to celebrate my freedom and my birthday simultaneously. Something shifted in Renato's expression, a flicker of understanding. 18-year marriage? How did you? You have the look, he said simply. Someone who's been part of a unit for so long that being singular again feels like missing a limb, even if you're the one who chose the amputation. The metaphor was dark, but accurate. And you? Are you celebrating anything besides another year older? Another successful acquisition, Renato said. My business involves finding rare objects, convincing their owners to part with them, and placing them with new owners willing to pay considerably more than the previous ones believed they were worth. An antiques dealer? I asked. Interest piqued despite myself. My grandmother had left me a small antique shop when she died 5 years ago, a dusty space in an older neighborhood that I'd kept meaning to revive, but never found the time or energy while married to Eduardo. Among other things, Renato replied, his tone suggesting layers I wasn't privy to. I specialize in European furniture and art from the 18th and 19th centuries. Items with provenance, history, stories to tell. We talked for an hour, maybe more. The music faded to background noise as Renato described a recent acquisition trip to Portugal, where he'd tracked down a set of hand-painted tiles from a demolished monastery. I found myself telling him about my grandmother's shop, the inventory gathering dust, my dream of transforming it into something viable. You should let me see it, Renato said suddenly. I have contacts, resources. Perhaps we could collaborate. The suggestion was both thrilling and terrifying. You don't even know me. I know you dance like you're afraid someone's watching, but wish they weren't, Renato said. I know you married too young and stayed too long. I know you're intelligent, because the questions you've asked about provenance and authentication aren't amateur curiosities. And I know that when you talk about your grandmother's shop, your entire face changes. That's enough for me to be interested in seeing what you have. The directness should have been off-putting. Instead, it was refreshing after years of Eduardo's passive-aggressive communication style. This is crazy, I said. I accidentally twerk on a stranger in a nightclub and an hour later we're discussing a business partnership? Is that what you were doing? Renato asked, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Twerking? I thought you were just dancing. The heat that flooded my face had nothing to do with the whiskey. Oh God, I really did, didn't I? I'm so sorry, Camille, Renato interrupted gently. Stop apologizing. You made my birthday infinitely more interesting than it would have been otherwise. Now, are you going to show me this shop? Or are you going to let it continue gathering dust while you figure out what 42 and divorced looks like? I met his gaze, seeing challenge there, but also genuine interest. What did I have to lose? Eduardo was gone, my daughter was away at university, and the shop was slowly decaying whether I did nothing or took a risk. Tuesday afternoon, I heard myself say. 2 o'clock. I'll text you the address. Renato pulled a business card from his jacket pocket, sliding it across the table to me. The cardstock was heavy, expensive, embossed with his name and a phone number. No company name, no website, just the essentials. I'll be there, he said. When I finally returned to Karina and Kelly, they ambushed me with questions I deflected with promises to explain later. The night wound down, the club slowly emptying as we collected our coats and called for a car. As we waited in the lobby, I glanced back toward the VIP balcony, catching a glimpse of Renato through the glass, watching my departure with an expression I couldn't quite read. In the car, I pulled out his business card, running my thumb over the embossed letters. What had I just agreed to? A business meeting with a man I'd met while accidentally grinding against him in a nightclub. My rational mind insisted it was insanity. But the part of me that had danced on that platform, the part that had been dormant for 18 years, whispered that maybe insanity was exactly what I needed. The antiquario sat on a quiet street in Pinheiros, sandwiched between a vintage bookstore and a cafe that had been there since the 1960s. I arrived an hour early on Tuesday, using the time to frantically dust surfaces and arrange the chaos into something resembling order. My grandmother had called this place Casa das Memorias, House of Memories, and it had been her pride and joy for 40 years before her death. Now it was mine, though I'd done little to honor her legacy beyond paying the minimal rent and occasionally stopping by to ensure vandals hadn't broken in. The inventory she'd left behind was substantial, but disorganized. Portuguese azulejos leaned against French armoires. Brazilian colonial furniture shared space with Italian marble busts, everything covered in a fine layer of neglect. I'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on tailored black pants and a cream silk blouse that I hoped struck the right balance between professional and approachable. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged papers on the cluttered desk near the front window, though whether from nerves or the 2 espressos I'd consumed, I couldn't say. At precisely 2 o'clock, a black Mercedes sedan pulled up outside. Renato emerged, looking every bit as polished as he had at the club, though the nightclub's dim lighting hadn't revealed the full impact of him in daylight. He wore a navy suit this time. No tie, the top button of his white shirt undone in a way that managed to look both casual and deliberate. I met him at the door, suddenly conscious of how shabby the shop must appear to someone who dealt in high-end acquisitions. "Welcome to the chaos," I said, trying to keep my tone light despite the anxiety coiling in my stomach. Renato stepped inside, and I watched his eyes move methodically across the space, cataloging, assessing. He said nothing for a long moment, just walked slowly through the narrow aisles between furniture and crates, occasionally pausing to examine something more closely. "Your grandmother had excellent taste," he finally said, running his hand along the carved back of a 19th century settee, "and terrible organizational skills." Despite myself, I laughed. That's the most diplomatic way anyone's ever described this place. "How much of this inventory have you cataloged?" Renato asked, pulling out his phone and snapping photos of various pieces. "Cataloged?" I repeated. "There's a ledger she kept, but it's mostly in Portuguese, and her handwriting was atrocious. I've been meaning to digitize everything, create a proper database, but between the divorce and work." I trailed off, the excuses sounding hollow even to my ears. "What do you do for work?" Renato asked, his attention now focused on a collection of ceramic pieces stacked haphazardly on a shelf. "I teach art history at a private school," I said. Or I did. "I'm taking a sabbatical this semester to figure out what comes next." Renato turned to face me, his expression thoughtful. "So you understand value, provenance, historical context? You just lack the business infrastructure to monetize it." The blunt assessment stung because it was accurate. "When you say it like that, it sounds pathetic." "It sounds like an opportunity," Renato corrected. He gestured around the shop. "You're sitting on easily 2 million reais worth of inventory. Probably more if everything's authenticated properly. Your location is good, not prime but respectable. The building has character. With the right investment and expertise, this could be extraordinary." 2 million reais. The number made my head spin. That's impossible. Most of this stuff has been here for decades. "Which means it's appreciated considerably," Renato said. He pulled out one of the chairs, a delicate Louis XV piece I'd always thought was pretty but unremarkable, and sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. "Let me propose something. A partnership. I provide the capital for restoration, proper inventory management, marketing, and connections to serious collectors. You provide the space, the existing inventory, and your expertise in art history. We split profits 60-40. 60-40 in whose favor?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Yours," Renato said. "It's your grandmother's legacy, your shop, your reputation in the community. I'm simply the facilitator." I stared at him, trying to find the catch in an offer that seemed too generous to be real. Why would you do that? You don't know me. Don't know if I can actually run a business successfully. I know you've kept this place alive for 5 years despite having every reason to let it go, Renato said. I know you understand the merchandise well enough to recognize quality even if you don't know current market values. And I know that when you talk about this shop, there's passion there. Passion is harder to find than capital. My phone buzzed with a text from Karina. How's the meeting with Mr. Nightclub? Don't do anything I wouldn't do, which leaves you plenty of options. I silenced it, focusing on Renato. What's the timeline you're imagining? 6 months for initial inventory and authentication, Renato said. 3 months for necessary restoration and shop renovation. 9 months total before we relaunch as a serious player in São Paulo's antiques market. I have a team that can handle the heavy lifting. Appraisers, restorers, designers. Your role would be curatorial and client-facing. It was everything I'd dreamed of doing with the shop, but had convinced myself was impossible. The practical part of my brain screamed warnings about going into business with a man I barely knew, about the risks of failure, about how Eduardo would mock me for this impulsive decision. But Eduardo was gone, and the part of me that had danced on that platform 4 nights ago, that had felt alive for the first time in years, wanted this with an intensity that surprised me. I want to see a formal proposal, I said. Contract terms, timeline, budget breakdown, everything in writing before I agree to anything. Renato's smile was approving. Walter will have everything ready by Friday. Shall we discuss it over dinner? The transition from business to personal felt deliberate, a test of some kind. Is mixing business and pleasure wise? Probably not, Renato admitted, but wisdom has never been my strongest quality. Besides, we need to discuss the actual inventory in detail, and I'd prefer to do it somewhere with better lighting than this shop currently offers. He had a point. The overhead fluorescents I'd installed years ago cast everything in harsh, unflattering light. Fine. Dinner on Friday, but somewhere public and well lit. I'll pick you up at 7, Renato said, standing and pulling out his phone. Give me your address. I rattled off my apartment building, watching him type it into his contacts. The casual efficiency of the gesture, as if we were already familiar, already part of each other's routines, should have felt presumptuous. Instead, it felt like a door opening, a path appearing where before there had only been fog. After Renato left, I spent the rest of the afternoon photographing inventory, my mind racing with possibilities. I called Karina, who listened to my rambling explanation of the proposal with unusual silence. Camille, she finally said when I paused for breath. Do you know who Renato Figueiredo actually is? The question sent ice down my spine. An antiques dealer, an importer, he told me. He's also known for having connections to the parallel market, Karina interrupted. Not illegal exactly, but gray area. There are rumors about how he acquires certain pieces, about deals made outside official channels. My brother-in-law works in customs. He mentioned Figueiredo's name once in a conversation about shipments that arrive with incomplete provenance documentation. I sank into my grandmother's old desk chair, the wood creaking under my weight. You're saying he's a criminal? I'm saying he operates in spaces most legitimate dealers won't touch, Karina said carefully. That doesn't make him dangerous necessarily, but it makes him complicated. Are you sure you want to go into business with someone like that? Was I? 24 hours ago, I would have said absolutely not. But sitting in the shop, looking at decades of accumulated beauty slowly deteriorating from neglect, I realized I didn't have better options. No bank would loan me the capital needed for restoration. No legitimate investor would look twice at a dusty antique shop run by a recently divorced art history teacher with 0 business experience. He's offering me a chance to actually do something meaningful with this place, I said. Maybe the only chance I'll get. Just be careful, Karina said. Men who seem too good to be true usually are, and men who grab your hips in nightclubs and then show up with business proposals definitely are. After we hung up, I researched Renato online. The results were sparse but intriguing. A few mentions in Portuguese business journals about successful auctions. A photograph from a charity gala 3 years ago, Renato in a tuxedo beside a woman I didn't recognize. No social media presence, no personal website, nothing that revealed the man behind the name. What I did find were whispers in collector forums, mentions of Figueiredo securing pieces other dealers couldn't touch. A disputed Caravaggio that had appeared in a São Paulo collection after being missing for decades. A set of pre-Columbian artifacts that somehow avoided repatriation laws. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough smoke to suggest fire. Friday arrived faster than I expected. I changed 4 times before settling on a burgundy dress that Karina had helped me pick out specifically for this dinner. "If you're going to dance with the devil," she'd said, "at least look amazing doing it." Renato arrived exactly at 7, driving himself this time in a vintage Jaguar that purred like a contented cat. He opened my door, his manners old-fashioned in a way that reminded me of my grandfather. The restaurant he'd chosen was in Jardins, intimate and expensive. The kind of place where prices weren't listed on the menu, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. The maitre d' greeted Renato by name, leading us to a corner table with practiced discretion. "I took the liberty of ordering wine," Renato said as we settled into our seats. "A Bordeaux from 1995, a good year." "The year I got married," I said without thinking. "Then we'll toast to endings and new beginnings," Renato replied smoothly. Walter had indeed prepared a comprehensive proposal, which Renato presented in a leather portfolio between our appetizer and main course. The terms were exactly as he'd outlined, the budget substantial but not outrageous. Everything professionally laid out, legally sound, ready for my signature. "You move quickly," I observed, scanning the dense legal language. "I've learned that opportunities have expiration dates," Renato said. "Hesitation is expensive." "And what opportunity am I exactly?" The question came out more flirtatious than I'd intended, the wine loosening my tongue. Renato set down his fork, his full attention focused on me in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You're someone who forgot how to dance and then remembered. That's rare. Most people who forget stay forgotten." "Is that what you think happened at the club?" "I remembered how to dance?" "I think you remembered how to not give a damn what anyone thought," Renato said. "That's more valuable than any antique in your grandmother's shop." We talked through dessert and coffee, the conversation flowing easily from business to personal and back again. I learned he'd been married once, briefly, in his 20s. No children, no drama. Just 2 ambitious people who wanted different futures. He'd built his business from nothing, starting as an apprentice to an Italian dealer who taught him to see value where others saw junk. "What about the rumors?" I asked finally, the wine giving me courage I wouldn't have had sober. "About how you acquire certain pieces." Renato didn't flinch. "I operate in gray spaces, legal but unconventional. I have contacts in places official dealers won't go. Sometimes that means navigating complicated politics. Sometimes it means paying more than market value to convince someone to sell. But everything I touch is legitimate by the time it enters the market. That's not exactly a denial of wrongdoing. Because I won't insult your intelligence with denials," Renato said. "Yes, I bend rules. Yes, I have relationships with people others consider unsavory. But I've never dealt in stolen goods, never trafficked in blood antiquities, never built my business on anyone's suffering but my own." The honesty was disarming. Eduardo had lied about everything from his whereabouts to his feelings. Renato's directness, his refusal to sugarcoat his reality, felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. "I need to think about this," I said, gesturing to the contract. "It's a big decision." "Of course," Renato said. "Take until Monday." But Camille, don't think too long. The version of you that danced on that platform 4 nights ago already knows what you want to do. He drove me home, walking me to my apartment building's entrance like we were teenagers on a first date. At the door, he caught my hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture so old-fashioned it should have been ridiculous, but instead sent heat racing up my arm. "Whatever you decide about the business," he said softly, "I'd like to see you again, if you're willing." I should have said no, should have kept professional boundaries firmly in place. Instead, I heard myself whisper, "I'd like that too." Over the weekend, I reviewed the contract obsessively, even consulting with a lawyer friend who declared it surprisingly fair. Monday morning, I texted Renato a single word: "Yes." His response came immediately: "I'll pick you up at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We have work to do." And just like that, my life shifted again, tilting toward something uncertain and thrilling and possibly dangerous. I thought about calling Karina, explaining my decision, but I knew what she'd say. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my apartment window, looking out at São Paulo's glittering skyline. Somewhere out there, Renato was probably doing the same thing. Planning, strategizing, moving pieces on a board I was only beginning to understand. But for the first time since my divorce, I felt like I was moving too. Not just reacting to life, but actively choosing it. The woman who'd backed into a stranger while dancing would have never made this choice. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She was becoming someone new, someone braver, someone willing to risk falling for the possibility of flying. The transformation of Casa das Memorias began with ruthless efficiency. Renato arrived that first Tuesday morning with a team of 6 people: appraisers, photographers, a database specialist, and 2 restoration experts who spoke in rapid Portuguese about varnish deterioration and wood rot as they moved through the shop with practiced eyes. I'd expected to feel overwhelmed, pushed aside in my own grandmother's space. Instead, Renato positioned me at the center of everything. Every piece required my approval before being catalogued. Every restoration decision came to me first. Every strategic choice about which items to prioritize was mine to make. "This is your vision," he said, when I questioned why he kept deferring to me. "I'm just the money and the muscle. You're the heart." The work was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. We discovered treasures I'd walked past for years. A signed Portinari sketch hidden behind a cracked mirror, a set of imperial-era Brazilian silverware wrapped in newspaper from 1889, Portuguese tiles that authenticated back to a demolished Lisbon palace. Each discovery felt like unwrapping a gift from my grandmother, her final lessons in seeing beauty, where others saw only dust. Renato worked beside me most days, his expensive suits replaced by more casual attire that still managed to look tailored. I learned he was meticulous to the point of obsession, that he had an encyclopedic knowledge of European decorative arts, and that he drank his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. I also learned he was generous with his team, paying them well above market rates, and treating them with respect that seemed rare in São Paulo's luxury goods world. The restoration experts, twin brothers named Zeferino and Klaus, had worked for him for 15 years. "He found us when we were apprentices with nothing," Klaus told me one afternoon. "Gave us opportunities no one else would. We'd walk through fire for him." The loyalty was touching and slightly unnerving. What kind of man inspired such devotion? And what did it cost him to maintain it? 6 weeks into the project, Renato invited me to dinner at his home in Jardim Europa, one of São Paulo's most exclusive neighborhoods. I'd assumed he lived in a modern apartment, all glass and steel and minimalist design. Instead, his home was a renovated colonial mansion, the architecture preserved, but the interior updated with stunning restraint. "My one indulgence," he said as he gave me a tour. "Everything else I acquire is for clients. This place is for me." The rooms were filled with pieces that would have made museum curators weep. A Baroque chest from Minas Gerais, paintings by Brazilian masters I'd only seen in books, furniture that told the story of 3 centuries of craftsmanship. But what struck me most was the library. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books in multiple languages, a rolling ladder providing access to the higher reaches. "You read all of these?" I asked, running my fingers along leather spines. "Most of them," Renato said. "My grandfather believed an uneducated man was a dangerous man. He made me read 3 books a week growing up, then discuss them with him over Sunday dinner." It was the first personal detail about his family he'd shared. "Where is he now?" "Dead 20 years, Renato said, his voice carefully neutral. "He built an import business from nothing, taught me everything about value and negotiation. Also taught me that rules are for people without imagination." The last sentence hung between us, loaded with meaning. "Is that why you operate in gray spaces? Because he taught you to?" "He taught me that legal and ethical aren't always the same thing," Renato corrected. "That sometimes the right thing requires going around obstacles rather than through them." Dinner was prepared by a chef who arrived, cooked, and departed with the same discretion as the maître d' from our first dinner. We ate on a terrace overlooking a garden lit by strategic lighting, the city's noise reduced to a distant hum. The wine was from Renato's personal cellar, a Portuguese vintage that tasted like complexity and time. "Tell me about your marriage," Renato said as we finished the main course. "What happened?" The question was unexpected, too intimate for our still new dynamic. But the wine and the warm night air made honesty feel possible. "We were too young when we married," I said. 23 and convinced we'd discovered something everyone else had missed. Then we had a daughter, and suddenly we were parents before we'd figured out how to be partners. "You don't talk about your daughter much," Renato observed. "Sophia's at university in London," I said. "Art history, naturally. She's brilliant and independent, and probably too much like me for her own good." Eduardo got the predictable academic daughter he wanted. I got someone who argues with me about Caravaggio's use of shadow. "She sounds remarkable." "She is," I said, feeling the familiar mix of pride and longing that came with an empty nest. When I told her about the divorce, she said it was about time. Apparently, she'd been expecting it for years. "Children see more than we think," Renato said. "They understand performance and reality better than adults do." "Did you want children?" I asked. Something shuddered in his expression. "Once. My ex-wife didn't. It was one of many incompatibilities we discovered too late." The meal ended with coffee and a dessert I was too full to finish. Renato walked me through the garden, pointing out orchids he'd collected from various countries, explaining their origins with the same passion he brought to furniture and art. "Everything you surround yourself with has a story," I observed. "Objects are honest," Renato said. "They don't lie about their origins or pretend to be something they're not. A 17th century Portuguese chair is exactly that. No more, no less. I find that restful." "What about people?" I asked. "Are we too complicated for you?" Renato stopped walking, turning to face me in the garden's soft light. "Most people, yes. But you? You're complicated in ways that interest me." He kissed me then. Not tentative or asking permission, but with the same confidence he brought to every decision. His hands cupped my face, gentle but certain, and I melted into him with a surrender that would have terrified me if I'd stopped to think about it. When we finally broke apart, both breathing harder, Renato rested his forehead against mine. "I should take you home before I do something we might regret." "Who says I'd regret it?" The boldness in my voice surprised me. "Camille," Renato said softly, "when we go there, and we will, I want you certain. Not wine-drunk and caught up in the romance of gardens and moonlight. I want you clear-eyed and choosing me anyway." The consideration in his words did more to seduce me than any practiced line could have. He drove me home, kissed me once more at my door, then left me standing in my apartment doorway wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. The next morning, I found a delivery at my door, a rare edition of a book on Portuguese ceramics I'd mentioned admiring weeks ago, wrapped in brown paper with a note in Renato's precise handwriting. For your education. Though I suspect you could teach the author a few things. R. Work on the shop intensified. We were approaching the 3-month mark, and Renato wanted to host a soft opening for select collectors, a way to test the market before our official launch. The shop had been transformed. New lighting that made everything glow. Restored floors that gleamed. Strategic staging that turned jumbled chaos into curated elegance. I barely recognized the space my grandmother had left me. What had been a dusty repository of memories was becoming something alive, something valuable, something mine in a way it never had been before. Your grandmother would be proud, Renato said one evening as we reviewed the final inventory list. You've honored her legacy while making it your own. The shop wasn't the only thing transforming. I'd started dressing differently, investing in clothes that made me feel powerful rather than invisible. I'd cut my hair, the shorter style framing my face in a way that made me look younger, sharper, more like the woman I was becoming. Karina had noticed, commenting that I looked dangerously happy, in a way that concerned her. You're falling for him, she'd said over lunch the previous week. And I'm worried about what happens when you hit the ground. Maybe I won't fall, I'd replied. Maybe I'll fly. Camille, women like us don't fly, Karina had said gently. We're too old to believe in fairy tales. But standing in the transformed shop, watching Renato negotiate with a client over a 19th century escritoire with passion and precision, I wondered if maybe 42 wasn't too old for new beginnings. If maybe the version of myself I'd discovered on that nightclub platform was worth the risk of believing. The soft opening was scheduled for a Friday evening, invitation only, with 30 carefully selected collectors and dealers. Renato had hired caterers, arranged for wine service, even brought in a string quartet to provide ambiance. I'd protested the expense, but he'd waved away my concerns. First impressions are everything, he'd said. We're not just selling furniture. We're selling a story, an experience, a vision of what sophisticated collecting looks like. 2 days before the event, Renato's phone rang during our afternoon inventory session. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting to something I'd never seen before. Concern bordering on fear. I need to take this, he said, stepping outside. Through the shop's front window, I watched him pace, his free hand gesturing sharply as he spoke in rapid Portuguese. When he returned 10 minutes later, the easy confidence I'd grown accustomed to had been replaced by tense calculation. What's wrong? I asked. Nothing that concerns the shop, Renato said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. A business complication. I'll handle it. But over the next 2 days, I noticed changes. Renato took more calls, always stepping away for privacy. Men I didn't recognize visited the shop briefly, conferring with him in hushed tones before departing. The restoration team exchanged worried glances when they thought I wasn't looking. The night before the soft opening, I confronted him. What's happening? And don't tell me it's nothing. Everyone's acting like we're preparing for a siege instead of a party. Renato was silent for a long moment, weighing his response. There's an investigation, he finally said. Federal customs agents. They're looking into some of my import documentation from the past 2 years. Ice flooded my veins. Are you in legal trouble? Possibly, Renato admitted. There's a shipment from Portugal that arrived last year. The provenance documentation was incomplete. Nothing stolen, nothing illegal, but enough questions to trigger an audit. Oh God, I said, sinking into a chair. The shop. If you're charged with something, if there's a scandal. The shop is clean, Renato interrupted firmly. Everything we've done here is completely legitimate. Your inventory, our partnership, none of it touches the questionable parts of my business. I made sure of that from the beginning. Why? I asked. Why keep it separate? Renato knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his. Because this matters. You matter. I wasn't going to contaminate something good with my complications. The admission was as close to a declaration of love as I'd heard from him. What happens if they charge you? Then I face it, Renato said simply. I've been preparing for this possibility for years. I have excellent lawyers, contingency plans. But Camille, if it comes to that, you need to distance yourself from me. Publicly, completely. For your own protection. I'm not abandoning you because things get difficult, I said, anger flaring. That's not who I am. I know, Renato said softly, but I'm asking you to anyway, if necessary. The soft opening proceeded as planned, Renato's mounting legal troubles invisible beneath his polished presentation. Collectors moved through the transformed shop with murmurs of appreciation, checkbooks emerging as they discovered pieces they couldn't resist. By the evening's end, we'd sold 6 major items, generated interest in a dozen more, and established Casa das Memorias as a serious player in São Paulo's antiques market. Renato and I celebrated with champagne after the last guest departed, the same brand we'd drunk the night we met. To improbable partnerships, he toasted. To dancing your way into trouble, I replied, and we both laughed, the sound echoing in the empty shop that had become so much more than my grandmother's legacy. But as I watched him, seeing the tension he tried to hide beneath celebration, I understood that our story was about to become more complicated than either of us had anticipated. The question was whether we'd survive it, or if his gray space world would consume everything we'd built. 3 weeks after the soft opening, federal agents appeared at Casa das Memorias just as I was unlocking the doors for the day. 2 men in unremarkable suits, badges already displayed, asking if Renato Figueiredo was on the premises. He's not here, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs despite having done nothing wrong. This is my shop. I'm the owner. Ms. Montero, the older agent said, consulting a tablet. We're aware of your partnership with Mr. Figueiredo. We're not here to search the premises or question your inventory. We simply need to speak with him about import documentation from his other business ventures. I gave them Renato's personal number, watching as they made the call from my doorstep. Whatever was said lasted less than 2 minutes. They departed with polite nods, leaving me shaking in the shop's entrance as morning commuters hurried past on the sidewalk. I called Renato immediately. Federal agents were just here looking for you. I know, he said, his voice tight. They called me after leaving your shop. Camille, we need to meet. Not at the shop, not at my house. Somewhere neutral. We met at a quiet cafe in Vila Madalena, far from either of our usual haunts. Renato looked like he hadn't slept, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, stubble darkening his jaw. They're building a case, he said without preamble. The customs investigation has expanded. They're looking at multiple shipments, questioning authentication papers, scrutinizing everything I've brought into the country over the past 5 years. But you said everything was legitimate, I said, fear and anger tangling in my voice. It is, Renato insisted. Legally. But there are gray areas in international antiques trade, technicalities about documentation timing, questions about whether pieces were properly vetted before export. Nothing criminal, but enough to make prosecutors interested if they want to make an example. An example of what? High-end money laundering, Renato said bluntly. They think I'm using antiques to move money for other interests. I'm not, but proving a negative is almost impossible. I sat back, the cafe's cheerful atmosphere suddenly oppressive. What does this mean for us? For the shop? The shop is protected, Renato said. Everything there is clean. All the documentation is perfect. I made sure of that specifically because I knew this day might come. He reached across the table, capturing my hand. But Camille, You need to prepare for this to get ugly. There will be media attention, questions about our relationship, speculation about whether you're complicit in anything. I'm not, I said firmly. And I won't let them make me run away like I've done something wrong. That's what I'm afraid of, Renato said softly. Your loyalty is going to cost you if you're not careful. Over the next month, Renato's prediction proved accurate. A business reporter from Estado got wind of the investigation and published a speculative piece about São Paulo's antiques underworld that mentioned Renato by name. Within days, other outlets picked up the story, each one adding more sensational details. Casa das Memorias got caught in the crossfire. 2 scheduled auctions were postponed by nervous clients. A profile piece in a design magazine was killed at the last minute. Phone calls from potential buyers became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I watched our momentum evaporate like water on hot pavement, years of my grandmother's work, and months of our partnership dissolving because of association and innuendo. The financial impact was devastating. We'd invested heavily in restoration and marketing, counting on sales to recoup costs. Without revenue, we were burning through reserves at an alarming rate. I'll cover the shortfall, Renato offered when I showed him the month's dismal numbers. Absolutely not, I said. That'll just make it look like I'm benefiting from whatever they're accusing you of. We operate on what the shop generates, or we don't operate at all. Renato's legal team consisted of 3 attorneys led by Walter Diaz, the man I'd briefly met at the nightclub months ago. They were preparing Renato's defense with the same meticulous attention to detail Renato brought to everything. But even Walter admitted the optics were challenging. Federal prosecutors want high-profile wins, he explained during a meeting at Renato's house. Even if they can't prove money laundering, they can make your life hell with documentation violations, import technicalities, tax investigations. They'll squeeze until something breaks. Then we don't break, Renato said simply. But the pressure was building. Renato's other business interests, the import company, his network of international dealers, were all being scrutinized. Assets were frozen pending investigation. Bank accounts were audited. Every transaction from the past decade was being examined for irregularities. Through it all, Renato remained eerily calm, as if he'd been preparing for this siege his entire career. He attended meetings with attorneys, cooperated with investigators, produced documentation on demand, all while maintaining his work on the shop's inventory and our relationship. How are you so calm? I asked one night as we reviewed authentication certificates for a collection of Brazilian colonial silverware we were considering for auction. Because panic is expensive, Renato said. I learned a long time ago that the moment you show fear, you've already lost. So I don't show it. Even to me? He looked up from the certificates, his dark eyes holding mine. Especially to you. You see enough of my complications without having to see me fall apart. I wouldn't think less of you for being human, I said softly. I know, Renato replied, but I'd think less of myself. The investigation reached a turning point in December, 6 months after the federal agent's first visit. Prosecutors formally charged Renato with 3 counts of import documentation fraud and 1 count of tax evasion. The charges were serious, but far from the money laundering allegations that had dominated media speculation. Walter called it a victory. They had nothing concrete, so they're going for technical violations. Maximum sentence is 3 years if convicted, probably less with good behavior, and we have strong defenses for all charges. But 3 years was 3 years. 3 years of Renato's life potentially lost to prison. 3 years of our partnership suspended. 3 years of uncertainty. I won't let this destroy the shop, Renato said as we sat in his library the night the charges were announced. Walter is setting up a trust structure that protects your interests regardless of what happens to me. The shop continues. You maintain full control. And if I'm convicted, my share of profits goes into an account you can't access but which ensures capital for operations. Stop talking like you're already gone, I said, voice breaking. I'm being realistic, Renato said. The trial starts in March, verdict probably by June. If convicted, I'll appeal, but that could take another year. I need to know you'll be okay without me. I don't want to be okay without you, I said, tears finally spilling over. I want you here, fighting this with me, not planning for your absence like it's inevitable. Renato pulled me against his chest, his hand stroking my hair with uncharacteristic tenderness. I've made peace with whatever happens, he said quietly. I knew the risks of how I operated. I'm not afraid of consequences, but I am afraid of destroying you in the process. Then don't, I said, pulling back to look at him. Don't push me away or try to protect me by leaving. Let me choose to stay. Let me choose you. Even if choosing me means enduring scandal and financial uncertainty and possible social exile. Even then, I said firmly, I didn't dance my way into your life to run away the first time things got hard. Renato kissed me then, deep and desperate, and I responded with equal intensity. We made love that night with an urgency born of uncertainty. Each touch weighted with the possibility of it being temporary, each moment of connection precious because we didn't know how many remained. Afterward, lying in his bed surrounded by the antiques and art he'd spent a lifetime collecting, I understood something fundamental. I'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with a man whose future was anything but certain, and rather than terrifying me, the realization felt like liberation. Whatever happens at trial, I said into the darkness, we face it together. No more protecting me. No more trying to shoulder everything alone. Partnership means the hard parts too. You're remarkably stubborn, Renato murmured, his arm tightening around me. I learned from the best, I replied. The months leading to trial were a strange limbo. The shop existed in a holding pattern. We maintained inventory, kept regular hours, saw occasional clients, but major deals remained elusive. I supplemented income by teaching online art history courses, using my sabbatical's end to return to work part-time. Renato spent most days with his legal team, preparing testimony, reviewing documentation, building defenses against charges that seemed designed more to punish than to seek justice. The stress showed in subtle ways: tension in his shoulders, shadows under his eyes, moments of distraction when I caught him staring at nothing. But we also found joy in small things. Sunday mornings in his garden, coffee and newspapers, and the comfortable silence of companionship. Evenings at the shop, organizing inventory and telling each other stories about the pieces we'd cataloged. Stolen afternoons in my apartment, making love with the desperation of people who knew their time together had an expiration date. The trial began the first week of March, coinciding with São Paulo's late summer heat. I attended every day, sitting in the courtroom's public gallery, watching Renato face prosecutors with the same composed confidence he brought to difficult negotiations. The evidence was technical, dense with customs regulations and import law. Walter's defense was methodical, demonstrating that every perceived violation was either an administrative error or a misinterpretation of complex international trade law. The prosecutors painted Renato as a sophisticated criminal, hiding illegal activity behind legitimate business. The defense portrayed him as a successful entrepreneur, caught in bureaucratic technicalities. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. I spent those days unable to eat, unable to sleep, existing in a state of suspended terror. Karina stayed with me, her earlier warnings about Renato forgotten in the face of my obvious anguish. Whatever happens, she said the night before the verdict, you'll survive. You're stronger than you know. The verdict came on a Tuesday afternoon. Guilty on 2 counts of import documentation fraud, not guilty on the tax evasion and one of the documentation charges. The conviction meant a mandatory sentence. The judge gave Renato 3 years, eligible for parole after 18 months with good behavior. I watched Renato receive the sentence with no visible reaction, his expression carefully neutral as the judge outlined terms. Only when they led him away in handcuffs, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom, did I see the mask crack slightly, revealing the man beneath the armor. Walter found me in the courthouse hallway, where I'd collapsed onto a bench, unable to stop shaking. "We're filing an appeal immediately," he said. The conviction was borderline, the sentence harsh for first-time offenses. "We have good grounds." "How long will an appeal take?" I asked through numb lips. "Minimum a year," Walter admitted. "Realistically, 18 months to 2 years before we get a hearing. In the meantime, Renato serves the sentence. 3 years, 18 months minimum." The numbers felt impossible, a chasm too wide to bridge. But even through the shock and grief, I felt something else. Determination. Renato had spent months preparing me to run the shop without him. Now I'd show him that preparation hadn't been wasted. The media coverage of the conviction was brutal. Headlines screamed about antiques fraud and high society crime, implying guilt far beyond what the jury had actually determined. The shop's phone rang constantly with reporters seeking comments. Clients who'd been neutral became actively hostile, their consignment agreements withdrawn, their interest evaporated. Within 2 weeks of the verdict, Casa das Memorias had lost 60% of its scheduled business. I stared at the empty appointment calendar and made a decision. If conventional clients wouldn't work with us, we'd find unconventional ones. If São Paulo's elite wanted to shun a shop associated with scandal, we'd build a different clientele. I reached out to younger collectors, people building first serious collections who cared more about quality and price than social acceptance. I partnered with interior designers in emerging neighborhoods, offering consignment terms established shops wouldn't consider. I leveraged my art history background to write authentication articles for trade publications, building credibility independent of Renato's tainted reputation. It was exhausting, humbling work. But slowly, gradually, the shop stabilized. Sales stayed modest, but consistent. The hemorrhaging of revenue stopped, then reversed. By the time Renato had served 6 months, Casa das Memorias was profitable again, not spectacularly, but sustainably. I visited Renato every week at the minimum security facility, an hour outside São Paulo where he'd been assigned. The first visit had been terrible, seeing him in prison clothes, the institutional setting stripping away all the sophistication that was so integral to who he was. "The shop is doing well," I'd told him that first time, determined to be strong. "We sold the Baroque cabinet to a collector in Brasilia, and I've negotiated a consignment deal with 3 new designers." Renato had listened with evident relief. "You're saving what I couldn't," he'd said quietly. "Thank you." "I'm not saving it for you," I'd replied. "I'm saving it for us. So when you get out, we have something to come back to." As the months passed, our weekly visits became the rhythm around which I structured my life. Renato was adjusting to incarceration with the same strategic thinking he'd applied to business. He'd organized an art appreciation class for other inmates, leveraging his expertise into a way to make the time meaningful. He read voraciously, worked in the prison library, stayed physically fit. "I'm not wasting these years wallowing," he told me during one visit. "I'm preparing for what comes after." "What does come after?" I asked. "Whatever we build together," Renato said, his hand finding mine across the table. "If you'll still have me." "Always," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. At 45, I discovered I was better at business than I'd ever imagined. The shop that had nearly collapsed in the wake of Renato's conviction had evolved into something resilient and innovative. I'd expanded into online auctions, partnering with European platforms to reach international collectors. The physical space in Pinheiros became a showroom for authenticated pieces while the real business happened digitally, connecting buyers and sellers across continents. Renato's appeal moved through the legal system with glacial slowness. Walter kept me updated on progress, filing briefs and motions that seemed designed more to demonstrate activity than achieve results. "The system doesn't favor appeals," he admitted during one update. We're building a record for federal review, but that could take years. Meanwhile, my visits to Renato continued every Wednesday afternoon without fail. I watched the seasons change through the prison's visiting room windows. Summer heat giving way to autumn cool, winter rains washing the glass, spring blooming beyond the barbed wire. Inside, Renato remained constant, his spirits remarkably unbroken, despite the grinding tedium of incarceration. "Tell me about the shop," he'd say every visit, and I'd spend our hour together recounting sales, challenges, small victories. He'd offer advice, strategic thinking that helped me navigate complications. Our partnership hadn't ended with his conviction. It had simply adapted to new circumstances. During one visit in his 18th month of imprisonment, Renato looked different. There was an energy to him I hadn't seen since before the trial. "I have news," he said. "The parole board approved my application. I'll be released in 6 weeks." I'd known the possibility existed, but hearing it made real left me momentarily speechless. 18 months. We'd survived 18 months of separation, of weekly visits, of building a business and relationship under impossible constraints, and now he was coming home. 6 weeks, I repeated, the words tasting like hope. "If you still want me to come home," Renato said carefully. "I know this has been hard. If you've changed your mind about us, I understand." I reached across the table, ignoring the guard's stern look at excessive contact, and gripped Renato's hand tightly. "I'll be waiting when you walk out of here, and then we're going to rebuild everything they tried to destroy." The 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I renovated the small apartment above the shop, creating a space for Renato to transition back to normal life. I organized his wardrobe from storage, had his favorite espresso machine professionally serviced, stocked the kitchen with groceries I remembered him preferring. Karina watched my preparations with gentle concern. "You know it'll be different when he gets out," she said one afternoon as we arranged furniture upstairs. "Prison changes people. You've both changed. Don't expect it to be exactly like before." "I'm not," I said. "We're different people than we were when this started. But different doesn't mean worse." The morning of Renato's release, I arrived at the prison an hour before dawn. The facility's parking lot was empty except for a few other vehicles, families waiting for their own releases, attorneys preparing paperwork. I sat in my car, hands shaking with anticipation and nerves, watching the eastern sky lighten. At precisely 8 o'clock, the prison's main doors opened and Renato walked out, carrying a small duffel bag containing the possessions he'd been allowed to keep. He was thinner than when he'd entered, his hair longer, and almost completely silver now at 51. But when his eyes found mine across the parking lot, his smile was the same one I'd fallen in love with in a nightclub 2 years ago. I ran to him, dignity forgotten, throwing myself into his arms with enough force to make him stagger. He caught me, held me, his face buried in my hair as we both shook with emotion too big for words. "You came," he whispered. "Did you think I wouldn't?" I pulled back to look at him, seeing the lines the past 18 months had carved around his eyes, the vulnerability he'd never shown before his incarceration. "I thought you might have come to your senses," Renato said. "Realized you could do better than a convicted felon." "Shut up," I said, and kissed him right there in the prison parking lot, pouring months of loneliness and waiting into the contact. We drove back to São Paulo in comfortable silence, Renato's hand resting on my knee, his attention fixed on the landscape passing outside the window. "The world looks different from this side of the fence," he said quietly. "Bigger, more vivid." I'd brought him to the shop first, wanting him to see what we'd built during his absence. He moved through the renovated space with wonder, touching furniture he'd helped authenticate, examining the new organizational systems I'd implemented, reading the framed reviews from satisfied clients I'd hung on the walls. "You didn't just keep it alive," he said finally. "You made it better." "We made it better," I corrected. Your advice during visits, your contacts who still trusted us, your vision that guided everything. You were never really absent. Upstairs in the apartment I'd prepared, Renato stopped in the doorway. I'd recreated elements from his house. The same coffee maker, similar art on the walls, even the same brand of towels in the bathroom. Small touches to make the space feel familiar rather than institutional. "You did all this for me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For us," I corrected. "This is our space now. A fresh start." We made love that afternoon with an intensity that surprised us both. 18 months of separation distilled into connection that felt both familiar and entirely new. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets with afternoon light streaming through the windows, Renato traced patterns on my bare shoulder. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Walter filed paperwork to officially transfer my shares of the shop to you. Complete ownership, no strings attached. You've earned it." I sat up, pulling the sheet around me. "I don't want that. We're partners." "You deserve security separate from me," Renato insisted. "If the appeal fails, if I end up back in prison, the shop needs to be protected. That means it can't be tied to me legally." "And what about personally?" I asked. "Are you going to protect me from yourself there too? Keep me at arm's length to spare me complications?" "Never again," Renato said firmly, pulling me back against him. "I learned something in there. Life's too short and too uncertain to waste on noble gestures. If you're willing to be tied to a convicted felon, I'm not going to argue." "Good," I said, "because I have plans for us, and they all require you being fully committed." The plans involved expanding Casa das Memorias into a full-service gallery representing emerging Brazilian artists alongside the antiques. I'd been developing relationships with painters and sculptors during Renato's incarceration, recognizing that contemporary art offered margins antiques couldn't match. Renato embraced the vision immediately, his business mind seeing opportunities I'd intuited but couldn't fully articulate. Together we refined the strategy, identifying gaps in São Paulo's art market we could fill. 3 months after his release, we hosted our first contemporary art exhibition, featuring 6 emerging artists. The opening was packed, collectors intrigued by the combination of established antiques expertise and fresh artistic talent, press interested in Renato's return to public life, friends and supporters who'd stayed loyal through the scandal. "Look at what we've built," I whispered to Renato as we moved through the crowded gallery. "This is ours. No one can take it from us." "They can try," Renato replied, his arm around my waist. "But we've proven we're harder to destroy than anyone expected." The exhibition sold out by closing night. We'd found our niche. Established collectors wanted the validation of our antiques expertise applied to contemporary purchases. Younger buyers wanted access to a curated selection they could trust. The business model worked beautifully, complementary revenue streams supporting each other. But success brought renewed scrutiny. A journalist writing a profile piece about São Paulo's art scene mentioned Renato's conviction, speculating about whether someone with a criminal record should be trusted in high-value transactions. The article was short, buried deep in a weekend supplement, but it triggered a new wave of questions about our credibility. "We could sue for defamation," Walter suggested when I showed him the piece. "No," Renato said firmly. "Fighting it gives it oxygen. Let it pass. Our work speaks for itself." He was right. The controversy faded within a week, replaced by coverage of our next exhibition. But the incident reminded us both that Renato's conviction would always cast a shadow, that we'd constantly need to prove ourselves despite our success. The appeal process finally concluded in Renato's 26th month of freedom. The federal appellate court upheld the conviction, but reduced the sentence to time served, based on good behavior and the technical nature of the charges. It was as close to vindication as we could hope for. Not exoneration, but acknowledgement that the punishment had exceeded the crime. "It's over," Walter said when he delivered the news. "The conviction stands, but there's no further penalty. You're free to rebuild without the appeal hanging over you. That night, Renato and I celebrated quietly in the apartment above the shop. We'd survived everything: scandal, conviction, imprisonment, rebuilding, scrutiny. We'd emerged not unscathed but stronger, our partnership tested and proven. "I have something for you," Renato said as we finished dinner. He pulled out a small velvet box I recognized from his house, the antique jewelry cases he'd collected over years. Inside was a ring, not modern, but a 19th century Portuguese piece with a small diamond set in intricate gold filigree. "It belonged to my grandmother," Renato said. "She gave it to my grandfather when he asked her to marry him despite his family's objections. I've been carrying it with me since the day I was released, waiting for the right moment." My breath caught. "Is this?" "Marry me, Camille," Renato said, not kneeling but standing before me with complete vulnerability. "Not because of the business or convenience, but because I can't imagine facing the rest of my life without you. You stood by me when I gave you every reason to run. Let me spend however many years I have left, showing you that faith wasn't misplaced." "Yes," I said through tears that were equal parts joy and relief. "Yes, of course, yes." The ring slid onto my finger perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. We made love that night, with the tenderness of people who'd survived the worst and chosen each other anyway, our bodies writing promises our voices couldn't fully articulate. At 47, engaged to a man who'd been to prison and back, running a business we'd built from scandal and determination, I'd never been happier. The life I'd imagined at 42, quiet, predictable, safely divorced, had been replaced by something infinitely more complicated and rewarding. "What should we do first?" I asked Renato as we lay in the darkness. "Wedding or Paris expansion?" We'd been discussing opening a second location in Paris, leveraging Renato's European connections to establish a presence in one of the world's premier art markets. It was ambitious, possibly reckless, exactly the kind of challenge we both craved. "Both," Renato said decisively. "Small wedding next month, just close friends. Then Paris by year's end. We're not getting any younger. Time to live like it matters." "It always mattered," I said, "even when it was hard." "Especially when it was hard," Renato corrected, pulling me closer. "Anyone can love someone during the easy parts. You loved me through prison. That's the kind of devotion men spend lifetimes searching for." I thought about the woman who drunkenly backed into a stranger while dancing at a nightclub, embarrassed and mortified. She'd had no idea that moment would lead here, to a business partnership that survived scandal, a love that deepened through adversity, a future that looked nothing like the one she'd planned, but was perfect anyway. "Thank you," I whispered to Renato. "For what? For grabbing my hips instead of stepping away, for seeing something in me I didn't see in myself, for building a life with me despite every obstacle." "Thank you for not stopping," Renato replied, referencing his first words to me. "For dancing into my life and refusing to leave even when it made sense to." Outside, São Paulo's traffic hummed its eternal rhythm. Inside our small apartment above Casa das Memorias, surrounded by the art and antiques we'd fought to preserve, we held each other and planned a future that had seemed impossible 2 years ago. The worst was behind us. The best was yet to come. We married on a Thursday morning in October at the small chapel in Jardim Europa, where Renato's grandparents had exchanged vows 60 years earlier. The guest list was deliberately intimate. Karina and Kelly, who dragged me to that fateful nightclub, Walter and his wife, Zeffirino and Klaus from the restoration team, and Sophia, my daughter, who'd flown in from London with her girlfriend. "You look happy, Mom," Sophia said as she helped me into the simple cream dress I'd chosen. "Really happy. Not the fake happy you had with Dad." At 24, Sophia had her mother's directness and her own hard-won wisdom. She'd been supportive of my relationship with Renato despite his conviction, recognizing something I'd taken months to fully understand: that my happiness mattered more than social acceptability. "I am happy," I said, meaning it completely. Terrifyingly, wonderfully happy. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. Renato stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, the same color he'd worn the night we met, his silver hair gleaming in the chapel's filtered light. When I walked down the short aisle on Sophia's arm, his expression transformed. Vulnerability and joy, mixing in a way that made my breath catch. We exchanged traditional vows with one addition Renato had requested. After promising to love and honor, we each added our own words. "I promise to never stop dancing," I said, "even when I forget the steps." "I promise to always catch you when you do," Renato replied, and everyone laughed through their tears. The reception was at Renato's house. Our house now, I reminded myself, still adjusting to the permanence of that change. We'd moved in together 3 months earlier, selling my modest apartment and combining our lives with the same strategic thinking we brought to business. The garden where he'd first kissed me had been transformed with string lights and carefully arranged tables. The menu featured Portuguese dishes Renato's grandmother had taught him to make, paired with Brazilian wines we'd selected together. It was intimate, personal, exactly what we both wanted. "To improbable partnerships," Karina toasted, raising her glass, "and to women who are never too old to start dancing." "To men wise enough to say, 'Don't stop,'" Walter added, earning laughs from everyone who knew the story of how we'd met. That night, alone in our bedroom after the guests had departed, Renato removed the antique pins from my hair with careful fingers. "Mrs. Figueiredo?" he said, the title still foreign and wonderful. "Mrs. Montero Figueiredo," I corrected. "I'm keeping my name. Can't have people forgetting whose grandmother's shop this used to be." "Fair enough," Renato said, kissing the curve of my neck. "As long as you're mine in the ways that matter." "Always," I promised, and showed him exactly what I meant. The Paris expansion consumed the next 6 months. Renato had located a space in the Marais, the historic district known for galleries and antique dealers. The location was perfect, but expensive, requiring capital we'd need to raise carefully to avoid overextending. We split our time between São Paulo and Paris, Renato handling European acquisitions while I managed both locations remotely. The work was exhausting, but exhilarating. Each challenge another opportunity to prove ourselves. The Paris shop, Camille and Renato Antiques as we'd decided to name it, opened in March to strong advance interest. European collectors appreciated the Brazilian perspective on Portuguese colonial art, while French buyers loved our curated selection of contemporary Brazilian artists. On opening night, standing in the renovated space with Renato beside me and 200 guests admiring our carefully chosen inventory, I felt something close to disbelief. How had we gotten here? From a drunken dance in a São Paulo nightclub to an international gallery launching in Paris. "You're thinking too hard," Renato whispered, his arm around my waist. "I can see the gears turning." "Just marveling at the journey," I said, "at how none of this was planned." "The best things never are," Renato replied. "You can't plan for accidentally backing into the right person." The Paris location exceeded our projections in its first quarter. We'd found a market hungry for the combination of old-world expertise and contemporary vision, collectors who appreciated the personal story behind our brand. Renato's conviction, which had seemed like a death sentence for our business in São Paulo, actually added mystique in France. European buyers found the narrative of redemption compelling rather than disqualifying. "We've accidentally made your criminal record a marketing asset," I said to Renato one night as we reviewed sales figures. "I'm not sure how to feel about that." "Feel grateful that suffering is never wasted if you learn from it," Renato replied. "Every mistake, every hardship, it all becomes part of the story we're selling." But success brought complications. The demands of managing 2 locations across continents meant constant travel, exhausting logistics, and strain on our still-new marriage. We'd gone from partners who saw each other daily to spouses coordinating across time zones, our relationship conducted through video calls and brief reunions. "This isn't sustainable," I said after a particularly grueling month where we'd spent only 5 days in the same city. "Something has to change." We were in Paris, in the small apartment above the Marais shop that mirrored our São Paulo arrangement. It was 2 a.m., both of us jet-lagged and irritable from travel. "What are you proposing?" Renato asked carefully. "We hire a manager for São Paulo," I said. "Someone we trust to run daily operations while we establish the Paris location. In 2 years, when both shops are stable, we reassess and possibly switch locations or bring in additional partners." The conversation stretched until dawn, both of us examining options, weighing risks, trying to find the balance between business growth and personal sustainability. We finally agreed on a modified version of my proposal, bringing in a managing director for São Paulo, while we spent the next 18 months primarily in Paris. The search for the right manager took 3 months. We needed someone with both antiques expertise and business acumen, someone we could trust with our flagship location while we were on another continent. We found her in an unexpected place, the federal prosecutor's office. Wendy Andrade had been one of the junior attorneys on Renato's case, assigned to research documentation. She'd left prosecution work shortly after the trial, disillusioned by what she'd seen as overreach in Renato's conviction. She had a law degree, an MBA, and a passion for Brazilian decorative arts. She was perfect. "You want to hire someone who helped prosecute me?" Renato said when I first suggested it. "I want to hire someone who understands regulatory compliance, has legal expertise, and knows exactly what mistakes to avoid because she's seen the consequences," I countered. "Plus, the optics of bringing on someone from the other side might help rehabilitate our reputation." Renato agreed, after interviewing Wendy himself. She started in July, shadowing me in São Paulo for 2 months before we officially handed over operational control. Watching her take command of the business we'd built was both terrifying and liberating. With Wendy managing São Paulo, Renato and I settled into Paris life. We rented a proper apartment in the 6th arrondissement, learned to navigate French bureaucracy, discovered favorite cafes and markets. At 49, I was living in Paris, running an international gallery with the man I loved. If someone had told 42-year-old me this would be her future, she would have laughed in disbelief. The Paris shop thrived under our direct management. We expanded into estate auctions, established relationships with major European collectors, and built a reputation for impeccable authentication and fair dealing. Renato's network from his pre-conviction days proved valuable. Connections who distanced themselves during the scandal now returned, reassured by our legitimate success. In our second year in Paris, we were approached by a consortium of Brazilian investors interested in franchising our model. They wanted to open Camille and Renato locations in New York, London, and Lisbon, using our brand and expertise to establish a global network of galleries. "We'd be licensing our name, our reputation," Renato said as we reviewed the proposal, "giving up direct control in exchange for expansion and capital." "Is that something we want?" I asked. "We fought so hard to build this ourselves. Do we really want to hand pieces of it to others?" We spent weeks debating, consulting with Walter on legal implications, running financial projections, examining every angle. The offer was generous, the terms favorable, the potential for growth substantial. But it meant fundamentally changing the nature of our business. In the end, we declined. The personal touch, the direct relationship with every piece and client, that was what made Casa das Memorias and Camille and Renato special. Scaling up would dilute what we'd built. "We're not empire builders," I told the consortium's representatives. "We're curators, quality over quantity, relationships over transactions. That's not something you can franchise." The decision felt right, aligned with who we'd become. Not everyone in our position would have walked away from that kind of money. But money had never been the point. The work itself, the partnership, the daily challenge of finding and placing beautiful things. That was the reward. At 51, Renato started talking about succession. "We won't do this forever," he said one night as we walked along the Seine. "Someday we'll want to slow down, travel for pleasure instead of business, spend time on other things. We should plan for that transition." "Are you saying you want to retire?" I asked, surprised. Renato seemed energized by the work, thriving on the challenges. "Not retire, evolve," he clarified. "Maybe in 5 years we bring in younger partners, people who can take the vision forward while we step into advisory roles. I've done the building from nothing phase. I'd like to experience the reaping rewards phase before I'm too old to enjoy it." The conversation continued over subsequent months, becoming part of our long-term planning. We identified potential successors, started grooming Wendy in São Paulo for expanded responsibilities, began sketching what a semi-retirement might look like. But life, as I'd learned, had other plans. On a Tuesday morning in June, checking email over breakfast, I received a message that made my hand shake so badly I nearly dropped my phone. The subject line read, "Estate sale of interest, Alberto Santos collection, Lisbon." I knew that name. Everyone in Portuguese antiques knew that name. Alberto Santos had been one of Europe's premier collectors of Brazilian colonial art, his private collection rivaling major museums. He'd died 3 months earlier, and his estate was being liquidated through a series of highly exclusive auctions. "Renato," I said, my voice strange to my own ears. "We need to go to Lisbon. Now." The Santos estate preview was limited to 50 pre-approved dealers and collectors. Renato's conviction had initially excluded us from the list, but Walter had leveraged our Paris success and reputation to secure an invitation. We had 48 hours to view the collection before the first auction. The Santos residence in Lisbon was a palace, literally, 4 stories of perfectly preserved 17th century architecture, filled with treasures that made even Renato, who'd seen everything, stop and stare. Brazilian Baroque furniture that had once graced colonial governors' residences, sacred art from demolished churches, ceramics and silverwork that documented 3 centuries of Portuguese-Brazilian exchange. "This is the collection of a lifetime," Renato whispered as we moved through the rooms. "Everything we've ever worked toward is represented here." "Can we afford to bid?" I asked practically. The estimates were astronomical, millions of euros for individual pieces. "We can afford to bid strategically," Renato replied. "Not everything, but select pieces that would anchor both locations. This is the opportunity we've been building toward." We spent 2 days evaluating, photographing, researching. Renato called in favors from conservation experts, arranged financing through dealers he'd partnered with over decades, built a coalition willing to bid jointly on certain lots. The auction was scheduled across 3 days, different categories each day. We targeted the final day, when colonial religious art and furniture would be sold. These were the pieces closest to our expertise, where our knowledge gave us an advantage over less specialized bidders. On the morning of the 3rd auction day, Renato and I sat in our hotel room reviewing strategy. We had authorization to bid up to 800,000 euros across 5 lots, money we'd secured by putting both shops up as collateral. It was a risk that would have terrified me 5 years ago. Now it felt like the culmination of everything we'd built. "Whatever happens today," Renato said, taking my hand, "we've already won. We're here. We're respected enough to bid. We've built something that gives us this opportunity. That's the real victory. Let's win the auction too," I said, kissing him. Victory is better with trophies. The bidding was fierce, competitive, exactly the high-stakes environment Renato thrived in. We lost the first 2 lots we bid on, outpaced by museums and private collectors with deeper pockets. But the 3rd lot, a paired set of Baroque side tables from Minas Gerais, we secured for 175,000 euros after a tense bidding war with a Brazilian museum. The 4th lot, a magnificent oratorio from an 18th century Bahian church, we let go. The bidding exceeded our limit quickly, and Renato knew when to walk away. But the fifth lot, the piece we'd identified as our primary target, we fought for with everything we had. A complete set of colonial-era furniture, 4 chairs, a table, and a cabinet, documented as having belonged to a Portuguese noble family before being shipped to Brazil in 1750. The provenance was impeccable, the condition extraordinary, the historical significance undeniable. The bidding started at 200 €. Within minutes it had doubled. Renato bid calmly, methodically, raising his paddle with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was willing to pay and why. When we hit 600,000 euros, only 2 bidders remained, us and a representative from a major American museum. At 700,000 euros, the museum representative hesitated, consulting via phone. Renato raised to 725,000 without blinking. The museum went to 750,000. Renato countered at 760,000, our absolute maximum. The room held its breath. The museum representative shook his head, withdrawing from bidding. The auctioneer's gavel fell. Sold to Paddle 47, Camille and Renato Antiques, for 760,000 euros. We'd done it, secured one of the most significant pieces in the entire estate. The room erupted in applause, recognition from our peers that we belonged at this level, that our journey from scandal to success was complete. That night, celebrating in our hotel room with champagne and exhausted elation, Renato pulled me onto his lap. "We just bet everything on a single purchase," he said. "We're either geniuses or fools." "We're dancers," I replied, thinking back to that nightclub platform. "We move without thinking too much about where we'll land. That's always been our strength." "Dance with me now," Renato said, standing and pulling me to my feet. There was no music, just the sound of Lisbon's traffic through the open window. But we swayed together in the hotel room, moving to a rhythm only we could hear. At 53, Renato looked distinguished in a way he hadn't at 48. The silver in his hair suited him. The lines around his eyes gave his face character. The confidence of survival and success made him more attractive than any physical feature. "I love you," I said against his shoulder. "Even more than I did when you grabbed my hips and told me not to stop." "I love you for not stopping," Renato replied, "for dancing into my life and refusing to leave even when it made sense to." We made love that night with the slow intensity of people who'd learned to savor moments, who'd survived enough to know that time was precious and not to be wasted on anything less than complete presence. The Santos furniture arrived in Paris 3 weeks later, authenticated and insured for twice what we'd paid. We featured it in a special exhibition at the Marais location, the centerpiece of a show documenting 3 centuries of Portuguese-Brazilian cultural exchange. The opening was attended by curators from the Louvre and Musée d'Orsay, collectors from across Europe, and press from major art publications. Standing in the gallery, watching sophisticated Parisians admire furniture we'd fought to acquire, I thought about the improbable chain of events that had led here. A drunken dance, a business proposal, a federal conviction, 2 years of separation, rebuilding against impossible odds, and now this. International recognition, financial security, a partnership that had survived everything life could throw at it. "You're thinking again," Renato said, appearing at my elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "Just marveling at the journey," I said, accepting the glass. "At how a single moment can change everything." "To dancing and to strangers," Renato toasted. "To strangers who catch us when we do," I replied, and we both laughed, the sound of people who'd survived enough to find joy in the absurdity of life's twists. The exhibition sold out before closing night. The Santos furniture alone generated enough profit to secure both shops' operations for the next 5 years. We'd done more than survive Renato's conviction. We'd built something sustainable, respected, uniquely ours. At 49, I had a business partner and husband I loved completely. 2 thriving galleries on different continents, and a future that felt full of possibility rather than predetermined. The version of myself who'd reluctantly climbed onto that nightclub platform wouldn't recognize the woman I'd become. But she was still there, somewhere inside. The part that could dance without caring who watched, that could take risks without knowing the outcome, that could back into a dangerous stranger and see possibility instead of threat. "Don't ever stop dancing," Renato whispered in my ear as the exhibition wound down. "Not planning on it," I replied. "We're just getting started." And standing there in our Paris gallery, surrounded by the fruits of our improbable partnership, I knew it was true. The best dances, the ones worth remembering, never really ended. They just evolved, finding new rhythms, new steps, new ways to move together through a world that tried its best to make you stop. But we hadn't stopped. And we wouldn't. Not as long as we had each other. Not as long as there were beautiful things to find and stories to tell and reasons to keep moving. The music might change, but the dance would go on.